Truth Espresso, episode 16.
Face it, we all would rather sleep in this morning. That's why God gave us espresso, to kickstart our zombified corpses into hyperdrive. And now, giving your mind and soul the morning shot of truth it craves. This is Truth Espresso with Daniel Minnick.
Hello, this is Daniel Minnick, and welcome to Truth Espresso. In this episode, we are continuing and, in fact, concluding a series of episodes responding to an article written by John Iriving, a novelist and screenwriter of abortion fiction, in the New York Times. In this article, The Long, Cruel History of the Anti-Abortion Crusade, John Iriving argues that abortion history in the 1800s really was a conspiracy by a bunch of doctors that managed to get abortion outlawed. Abortion was allegedly very well respected in society, according to Mr. Irving, but somehow a bunch of doctors got together and somehow their will was done, and they seem to argue for the value of life, but this was allegedly really a cover for their real intent to control women's reproductive rights and to really be the only licensed practitioner of medicine when it comes to prenatal care and birth and what have you. Women's health. And so the last episode, we actually looked at a very key figure in this period, and we actually did what Mr. Irving did not seem to do, which was to read their words and not simply ascribe to doctors like Horatio Storer a malicious intent that is not reflected in the words. And we saw that Dr. Storer actually argued persuasively, and he believed that abortion was wrong, that it was a crime against the life of the child in the womb, and that it had adverse effects on the health and life of the mother. And so we are going to continue from the legacy of Dr. Storer, and we're going to look at how Dr. Storer's efforts actually led to laws that outlawed abortion because of how persuasive he was. And then we're going to contrast this period of the mid to late 1800s. The philosophy of this period of the 1800s was consistency in understanding life and crime. And then the 1900s, how the philosophy changed there to turn life back around to a question of, are some lives actually worth more than others? Are some lives worth preserving and not others? And see how this led to scaling back the laws against abortion and making them illegal, making abortion legal again, but not because of new scientific discoveries in embryonic development, but because of changes in philosophy. And so we go back to Dr. Horatio Storer and the movement in the 1800s. So because of the persuasive efforts of the American Medical Association, and particularly the letters and books from Dr. Horatio Storer, by 1860, 20 states passed new laws against abortion. Wow, that's about 3 years after the AMA report. So let's ask the question, what makes more sense? Did this very young AMA have an army of lobbyists in the state legislatures to pay off politicians to promote a self-serving agenda? Did they stick a gun in the ribs and threaten the representatives and senators with their lives if they didn't pass laws against abortion? Were the elected representatives so incredibly naive that they reacted without thinking because some doctors sent them some papers with words on them? Were they really self-serving men who simply didn't know how to put their desires into law until some doctors gave them the perfect excuses? So, would any of those questions make sense? Or would it just make more sense to realize that Storer argued the truth based on the advances in science, and then the law was persuaded by it because it made a whole lot of sense? There was no conspiracy. There was no dishonesty here. If this wasn't about male doctors wanting to dominate women and control their reproductive rights. It was simply realizing the truth of science and acting accordingly. Also, note that in England, in 1869, a law was passed called the Offenses Against the Persons Act, which banned all abortions because life notably began at conception. Imagine that. Is this a coincidence? Did Dr. Storer have cronies all the way in England doing his bidding? Or perhaps maybe because science showed that life begins at conception, and consistency would demand that taking the life of a living human being is murder, and that therefore abortion is also murder. There is no obvious historical link that anyone can find between Dr. Storer himself and this law in England. But the scientific advances were happening in both the United States and in England in the mid-1800s. Don't you just love consistency of thought? What makes more sense after reading the AMA report and the works of Dr. Storer himself is that maybe, just maybe, they actually demonstrated that science proves that life begins at conception, that current practices at the time were working in ignorance and or in spite of reality, and that both the life of the unborn and the health of the mother are best served in the long run by respecting nature. So, as we continue on in the history of the 1800s, on March 3, 1873, the U.S. Congress passed the Comstock Act that attempted to forbid any sale or publication of any item or piece of literature that would be for the purpose of pornography or to be advertised or used as a contraceptive or abortifacient, particularly by mail handled by the U.S. Postal Service. Now, I will admit that the language of this act, as I actually read the words of this act, was way too broad not to be potentially abused or misunderstood, and very much likely sealed its fate to lose the test of constitutionality. So I personally couldn't in good conscience support this kind of broad and undefinable legal effort. I lean more toward the idea that actually committing an act of murder or adultery or anything like that, and murder would include abortion, should be punished. But attempting to criminalize literature or sales of items that could potentially be construed or advertised or whatever as aiding a problematic act is, in my understanding, kind of a overreach and too broad to be objectively enforced. Now, this only applied to the process of mailing things via the U.S. Postal Service, but there were not many other efficient means of transmitting things otherwise. But nevertheless, let's keep in mind the spirit of this law reflected the tide of thinking that the Crusade of the American Medical Association made possible. Now we move on. In 1890, statutes banned abortion in all cases except to save the life of the mother of the child. and this determination required the consent of more than one doctor. Now, up until the eugenics movement of the early 1900s, laws against abortion were based on the consistent idea that to kill any human being is murder because all human beings have the right to life. But as the eugenics movement started to claim in the early 1900s that some lives were worth preserving and other lives were better off dead or having never been born, we can get the picture about why laws against abortion began to be scaled back in the mid to late 1900s. Instead of seeing the weak, the minorities, or the indefensible as needing the protection of the law for life, they were viewed as something to be weeded out of society. Enter Margaret Sanger. Now, Sanger did not originate the eugenics movement. She became an ardent supporter of the movement, and her campaigns for birth control and contraceptives inexorably had the principles of eugenics in mind. Eventually, the Nazi regime in Germany adopted the principles of eugenics to exterminate ethnicities they viewed as inferior to their idea of the favored so-called Aryan European races. Now, am I claiming that Sanger was a Nazi? Not at all. But I am saying that the principle of eugenics that undergirded Sanger's philosophy of so-called planned families, sizes of families, birth control, and race improvement also undergirded the practices of the Nazi regime. So, when abortion advocates quote the controversial sentences I mentioned earlier from Dr. Horatio Storer in favor of life, that they falsely claim is racist, I could multiply quotes from Margaret Sanger that emphasize death as being racist. Even if these quotes from Margaret Sanger do not mean in context what they appear to mean, supporters of Sanger will claim that we should cut her some slack because she was a product of her time. Well, then why can't we cut Dr. Storer some slack for the precious little he said that appears to have issues? Without further ado, I will present you some quotes from Margaret Sanger. And all of the links to these quotes will be in the show notes for this episode. So, from an article entitled Highlights in the History of Birth Control, published in October 1923 by Margaret Sanger, quote, "Succinctly and with telling brevity, these two words sum up our whole philosophy. Birth control does not mean contraception indiscriminately practiced. It means the release and cultivation of the better elements in our society and the gradual suppression, elimination, and eventual extinction of defective stocks, those human weeds which threaten the blooming of the finest flowers of American civilization." Unquote. So, perhaps, maybe or maybe not, Sanger could be talking about races that she wanted to see less of or eliminated. She can be talking about, eugenics as far as defects and, retardation and stuff like that. But we see the philosophy of eugenics clearly here. The purpose of birth control, in her mind, she says, sums up her whole philosophy, and this is to engineer society and get rid of defective stocks, calling them human weeds. And she thinks of, Margaret Sanger quite a few times referred to civilization as a garden that she wanted to cultivate, and flowers, she wanted flowers to bloom rather than weeds. Next quote from Margaret Sanger comes from Margaret Sanger's book entitled Woman and the New Race. This is from chapter 5 of the book, entitled The Wickedness of Creating Large Families. And this book was published in 1920. To quote Margaret Sanger, labor is oppressed because it is too plentiful. Wages go up and conditions improve when labor is scarce, unquote. So this is faulty philosophy at the time, thinking that there was a problem with overproduction at the time. We needed less produced for the health of the economy. So let's ask someone like Robinson Crusoe if his life were easier or more difficult on a deserted island than someone in a larger civilization who can partake of the fruits of labor. Now, another quote from chapter 5 in this book, according to Sanger, quote, "The most merciful thing that the large family does to one of its infant members is to kill it," unquote. Yes, she did say kill it. Okay, continuing Margaret Sanger, in an article that she wrote published on March 27th, 1934, Article 4, called America Needs a Code for Babies. Sanger, in this article, proposed a legal baby code that separates a marriage license from a parenthood permit. Yes, you should need to apply for a permit that allows you to have children. Here are two of the articles of this code that Sanger proposed. Quote, Article 3, a marriage license shall in itself give husband and wife only the right to a common household and not the right to parenthood. Article 4, no woman shall have the legal right to bear a child, and no man shall have the right to become a father without a permit for parenthood, unquote. Wait a minute. No woman shall have the legal right to bear a child? I thought abortion advocates were all about the reproductive rights of women, but Margaret Sanger wanted to make the state control the reproductive rights of women who want to have children. Continuing on the quote, Article 6, quote, no permit for parenthood shall be valid for more than one birth, unquote. So each birth requires a separate permit. Ouch! And of course, in Article 5, the state determines if the parents have the financial means to support the child. So, a marriage license, in summary, only permits a husband and a wife to live together, but not to produce children. She proposed that they need a separate permit for producing children, and they have to obtain a permit for every child, a separate permit for every child, and this permit would only be granted if the state determines that they should be allowed to have a child. So much for reproductive rights. Yet, the same Margaret Sanger was the founder of Planned Parenthood, the nation's largest tax-subsidized chain of women's health providers and the largest resource for abortions. It seems that in Margaret Sanger's mind, Planned Parenthood is not planned by the mother, it's more planned by the state, social engineering. Can we put the pieces together as to the Sanger philosophy? As I mentioned before, I will put Dr. Storer's misunderstood statements that champion life against Sanger's statements that champion death and state control over the family institution any day. But getting back to Mr. John Irving, which is what these episodes are responding to, because of the movie based on John Irving's book, The Cider House Rules, John Irving gladly received the Maggie Award from Planned Parenthood, and the award is named after Margaret Sanger. Of course, how many pro-life institutions exist today that are supported by robbing people of the fruits of their labor via taxes? How many of them hand out a Horatio Storer Award? There are plenty of pro-life advocates who have never even heard of the name Horatio Storer. And, of course, most pro-life advocates want individual constitutional freedom and civilization and don't demand that their ideas be supported via theft from taxation. They don't believe that their views should be enforced by a police state. They don't believe that women should be forced to be childbearers for misogynistic men, as abortion advocates will try to proclaim. We pro-lifers believe in the institution of the family. We believe that childbearing should normally be a result of the institution of marriage, and the institution of marriage should be the result of good moral sense and planning for the future. But since leftists are often the ones who advocate promiscuity and sex on tap, they are the ones creating the breeding grounds for, quote, so-called unplanned pregnancies. Nevertheless, the reason for the pro-life movement is to be consistent and answer the question, what is the unborn? And consider all individual lives deserving equal protection under the law. The left wants to advocate policies that argue that some lives are more valuable than others under the law, and some have more of a right to live than others. It just seems to me that the leftist mindset wants to put people at war with each other over classes, ethnicity, gender, and everything else. Husband and wife are not allowed to be united in purpose for raising a family because husband and wife are different. In the leftist paradigm, they have to be at war with each other over their gender, and children have to be at war with their parents. Abortion is one of those cases where the left redefines it from what it scientifically is, the killing of living human beings. Abortion becomes a polarizing issue to divide men from women, although it takes a man and a woman to make a child. It's all about the rights of women against men in power. We can't even assume that the ideal anymore is a strong family unit where husband and wife love each other and work together toward the goal of training their children to carry on values to the next generation and be faithful parents themselves. We are supposed to assume that the accepted norm is that men and women, younger and younger, are supposed to have intimate relationships outside and before the mutual commitment of marriage when they aren't yet ready to start a family and provide for themselves, much less others. The solution is to assume the right to play around, and the natural consequences are nothing but a disease to be killed and extracted like a cancer. All the while, we are losing the idea of preserving and equipping any future generation. We don't want fathers and mothers anymore. We want everyone to be genderless automatons who gather in large numbers to protest how everyone else is oppressing us. Instead of parents, we want an ever bigger and more intrusive government to take the role of provision. We don't want responsibility, we simply want provision. And this provision doesn't come from hard work producing things and adding to the stock of the economy. It just comes from votes and guns to redistribute productivity. Well, I hope that this history lesson in the 1800s and early 1900s helps to shed some light and avoid some confusion about abortion laws in the United States. We could have spent many more hours covering abortion history, because we didn't even get into the mid to late 1900s and the rollback of laws, including the case of Roe versus Wade and the case of Doe versus Bolton, or cases and laws afterwards. What is relevant to this discussion is that the philosophy changed concerning life. Science showed us what the fetus in the womb really is. Philosophy in the 1800s responded to that science with consistency by understanding that a life is a life. Then a new philosophy emerged in the 1900s that wanted to reverse the natural conclusions of science by asserting that not all life is equally valid. Thus, the modern abortion movement is a triumph of subjective philosophy over the objective conclusions of science and morality. Mr. Irving's abortion fiction need not apply.
Thank you for waking up with Truth Espresso. Good morning, and God bless your day.
Hey friends, Daniel Minnick here again. If you liked waking up to this episode of Truth Espresso, I would really appreciate it if you would rate it on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or whatever application you use to listen to Truth Espresso.